Have you ever found yourself looking for something, even frantically turning over everything in your house trying to find it, and then it ends up being someplace really obvious? I've done that. Searched for my car keys all over the house and then figured out that they were in my pocket. That happened. I've watched young people who shall remain nameless, who, when asked to get something out of the refrigerator, maybe a bottle of ketchup, return from the kitchen empty-handed, insisting that the ketchup wasn't there. And then when I go in there to verify this, it turns out to be on the middle shelf, right out in front, wearing a top hat and carrying a cane and doing a dance routine singing, "Here I am, ketchup." But who am I to poke fun at them, these nameless children who are most definitely not my kids? Like I said, I've done the exact same thing, missed what was right there in front of me, all because somehow my eyes were kept from recognizing that thing. Car keys, ketchup. How does that even happen? Every time I feel foolish. We all do it, after all. We all fail to see what's right in front of us sometimes. Here's one of the funniest examples I can think of. My senior year in high school, I went to a tiny school up in the Rocky Mountains with a little over 100 students. I can't remember how many people were in my graduating class exactly, but it was somewhere around 35 or 40. So I knew everyone pretty well, including one guy named Harry. We weren't best buddies, but we were friends. It was a small school, and we were a pretty tight-knit community. I actually lived on this high school campus because my dad was working overseas. So I saw pretty much every other student, at least in passing, every single day, including Harry. There weren't that many of us. Anyway, I graduated, left Colorado, and lived in Georgia with my mom for almost a year working as a laborer. Then I joined the Navy, and after my initial training, I was stationed in Groton, Connecticut for submarine school, and then my first ship. And my first submarine was due to be decommissioned, meaning taken out of service, a couple of years after I reported aboard, but the boat got beaten up in a storm and our decommissioning was moved up. So we were ordered to change home port to the west coast, where the shipyard we would decommission the boat was, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. And being on a decommissioning crew is great. After they start mothballing the submarine, the workload for the crew goes down a lot. Our captain actually gave us permission to take classes at a local junior college during the workday, so I did. I took a couple of classes while I was there, one world history class and a political science class, I believe. And as I was walking around the campus, I would occasionally see this guy who looked exactly like Harry from my high school in Colorado. Have you ever seen someone who just looks exactly like a friend of yours or a family member? You're at a restaurant or a grocery store and you glance around and think, wait, is that Bob? Is that Susie? That's what this was like. I'd see this guy and every time I'd think, wow, that guy looks exactly like Harry. Anyway, after a few months in Washington, I was transferred to a submarine that was finishing a major overhaul and then was headed back to the East Coast, to Norfolk, Virginia. And a few months after that, I realized, wow, my high school reunion's coming up, my 5-year reunion. So I took a week's leave and flew to Denver and then drove with a couple of my friends up into the mountains for the reunion. I saw Harry shortly after I got there, and I went up to him to catch up. He asked me what I was doing, and I told him about being in the Navy. And after we'd been talking for a minute, I said to him, "You're not going to believe this, but I was out in Washington State last year at the shipyard taking classes in my spare time, and I saw a guy who looked exactly like you at that school." And Harry laughed and said, "Should have said something, dude. That was me." He said dude a lot. I guess for some reason I associated him with one time and place in my life, and in spite of the fact that he still looked like himself, my eyes were kept from recognizing him. Often, when I read this story from the Gospel of Luke during worship, people ask later, how could they not tell it was Jesus? Did he look different? And I suppose that's possible, but it's also possible that his two disciples didn't recognize him because they knew he was dead. So obviously it couldn't be him. That's a really good reason to know that the guy walking beside you isn't Jesus. Jesus is dead. Sure, the tomb was supposedly empty. Sure, the women claimed that angels had said Jesus was raised from the dead. But chances are, I'd still assume, as they apparently did, that if he was dead Saturday night, he was still dead Sunday morning. Yes, their grief was probably distracting them. Grief does that. But it was probably more that on some level, they just knew that Jesus couldn't possibly be there with them. So really, it's even more understandable than my story about Harry, isn't it? The fact that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. Maybe they glanced at that guy walking along with them and thought, wow, that guy sure looks a lot like Jesus did before he died. They even talked to him at length. They told the guy who looked a lot like Jesus about what had happened to Jesus. That's an odd situation, isn't it? And then even weirder, this guy who looked so much like Jesus started teaching them things, just like Jesus had. Incredible to meet another teacher who taught the same kind of stuff as Jesus, and so soon after Jesus had died. How lucky they must have felt. And then as they approached Emmaus, their destination, the guy who looked a lot like Jesus started to walk away from them. And they said to him, "Stay with us. It's almost evening and the day's nearly over." They sat down to eat together, and in a moment of comprehension that I understand all too well, they watched as the guy who looks a lot like Jesus took the bread, broke it, and gave it to them, exactly as he had a few days earlier. They finally recognized him, and then he disappeared from their sight. And then they said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" In other words, it was just so crazy because it seemed impossible because we knew he was dead, but at the same time, he was right there beside us. And it's easy to have a laugh at the disciples, but the reason we're laughing is that as much as we hate to admit it, we're as foolish and slow of heart to believe as they are. We miss not just the deep spiritual mysteries people have contemplated for centuries, even millennia. We miss the basic things, like remembering Jesus is always with us. How do we know he's there? Well, he promised, for one thing. He promised that the Holy Spirit would surround us too. But sometimes it's hard to tell if he's there or not. Of course, the other problem is that we're human and we often fool ourselves. Sometimes Jesus feels very close at hand, other times he doesn't. Maybe right now it's harder to find Jesus. It has sometimes felt that way to me in my life, and it certainly does sometimes right now. This is normal, even for disciples of Jesus. When we're not paying attention to our faith lives, or we're under stress, or maybe even facing illness, or our own mortality. There are so many things that can cause us to misplace our keys, not see the ketchup, and not realize that the guy who looks just like Harry might in fact be Harry. And of course, not see Jesus, even when Jesus is right there with us, especially when things are tough, like now. But deep down, I know he's there. I'll bet you do too. So look away from what you've been distracted by. Find time to say your prayers. In the midst of what is troubling us, breathe deeply and know that whatever is facing you, whatever is facing me, Jesus is there beside us and the Holy Spirit is within us, and it's going to be just fine. Because he's not gone. He's just waiting for us to look in the right direction and recognize him.